Hello, hello, hello. I'm going to start right up. Everyone's very much on time tonight. We have a few other people joining us, but I'll start in. Welcome, welcome. I'm Laura Reckford, Executive Director of the Falmouth Art Center. I hope you all enjoyed this beautiful day, wherever you're joining from. It's great to see all of you tonight, and we're so excited about tonight's program with Carol Scollans speaking about American modernism in New England. First, a few announcements. We are recording tonight's session because there were several people who registered but could not make it, and so we'll be able to send them the recording. Some quick Zoom tips for those who are unfamiliar with Zoom. The mute button, your mute button, which is a picture of a little microphone. It is usually in the bottom left, sometimes the top right or left, depending on your device. And you'll want to keep yourself on mute, which is the red line, unless you want to ask a question. Turns out the microphones on these devices are very sensitive. They even pick up if you're moving in your seat. So if you are not muted, we'll hear your dog bark and your phone ring, your spouse ask about dinner and everything else going on in your house. But never fear, if we do hear your household, we will go ahead and mute you. If you want to be seen, you simply click the little video camera next to the mute button, and you just click that and the red line that goes away. Or you click it and have the red line, and that means we don't see you and we just see your name. And you do have two different views on a toggle, which are the speaker view and the gallery view. That toggle is usually on the upper left or the upper right, depending on your device. Gallery view is what we affectionately call the Brady Bunch view. That's where you see everyone who's here in equal size boxes. Speaker view puts the person speaking in one big box and everyone else is in small boxes. So you might want to use the speaker view during the talk, and you can check out everyone who's here by looking at the gallery view. We'll also be using the shared screen during this, and when the shared screen is on, you will see a couple of boxes, and you can minimize them if you like by hitting the horizontal line in the upper left corner of the boxes. And Carol does welcome your questions throughout the talk, but please put your questions in the chat, and that's usually at the bottom of your screen there. And I will monitor it throughout the talk, and I'll go ahead and interrupt to ask the question so we can get the question in while the subject is fresh. And we will also be doing a question and answer at the end, so you can ask your questions then through the chat as well. And that's it for the Zoom tips. And now to some quick info about You Art What You Eat. This is the 11th year of our spring fundraiser. And as you may know, most years this takes place in person at local restaurants. We moved it to Zoom for this pandemic era. And we do have 4 terrific speakers in April. This is the second one. Many of you have signed up for all 4, which is great. And if you do sign up for all 4 and you miss one, as I said, just ask us and we're happy to send you the link to the recording you missed. Next week on Tuesday, April 20th, we will have art historian Elaine King talking about spirituality in contemporary art. So I know we'll all enjoy that as well. And the following week on Thursday, April 29th, we have Jay Critchley, a Provincetown artist known for his provocative installations, and he will speak about his current project called Democracy of the Land, Mobile Warming. And actually today, Jay Critchley installed his special banner here at the Falmouth Art Center depicting the Mayflower Compact with images of women replacing the men in the famous murals of people who signed the document. So you can check that out here at the Art Center. Each night of the art talk, as you all know, is paired with a restaurant just to support our local restaurants who are struggling. And I know we'll all enjoy our dinners tonight from Quick's Hole Tavern in Woods Hole. We have a special gift bag for all of you who signed up with a piece of handmade pottery and a special weaving made by our local artistic community. So please stop by and pick up your gift bag if you haven't already. We also thank our sponsors, Karen and John Burton from Sotheby's Realty, who have made this whole event possible. And a brief plug about the Falmouth Art Center. We are free and open to the public daily. We have 3 new exhibits every month. And right now we have Splash of Color with 90 pieces by more than 60 local artists, lots of different mediums represented. In a second gallery, we have Portraits and Figures by Diana Lee, Ruth Leach, Peg Wilson, and Kathy Vanderbilt. And we have the show Inspired by Sudoku with our, many of our fiber artists have made weavings inspired by that popular math puzzle. And we also have virtual art receptions every month here, the second Monday of the month on Zoom. And our classes are on Zoom and in person. Our summer vacation camps for kids are in person. They're filling up very quickly. And you can check out our website for everything else going on. And now to tonight's program. I am so pleased that Carol Scollans was able to be here tonight. Some of you may have heard our first Zoom talk ever last spring when she gave a presentation about the Monet paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Professor Carol Scollans has been a senior lecturer in art history for the art department at UMass Boston for over 20 years. She is also an independent scholar and curator. Her specialty has been the study of American art, and in particular, art, artists, and collectors from Boston. She has lectured both here and abroad on French and American 19th and 20th century painting, sculpture, graphic arts, and photography. Her publications include works for the University of Massachusetts Press, the New Hampshire Historical Society, Oxford University Press, and the University of New Hampshire Press. She is currently researching a book in preparation for a future exhibition on the artists from the island of Appledore in the Isles of Shoals, and you'll hear more about that place tonight. And so without further ado, welcome Professor Scollans.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here, Laura. Thank you so much for inviting me back, and looking forward to a wonderful interaction as we have had in our previous incarnations of these Zoom sessions. I'm going to start just by putting up a visual here, if you'll forgive me for a second, just to share the screen. And talk a little bit about what the context of the material is that I'm going to be discussing tonight. The influence of modernism is an enormous topic, one that we could spend days on. And I've sort of synthesized it down to a few of the things that I think are of significance and importance to us, particularly if we're here in New England. And I'm focusing on the artists that, for the most part, predominate the coast from Maine down to Provincetown as part of my discourse. And it's because I think that there's a kind of richness and diversity associated with those artists and individuals who are really sort of on the cutting edge, what we consider to be the vanguard of that transformation from a rethinking of realism to the transition to abstraction, and then ultimately to what we call non-representational art, something similar to exactly what I'm showing you behind me, and what we call non-objective art. And there's a really nice sort of flow to the materials that are being produced along the coast, and landscape tends to be one of those subjects that lends itself to the evolution of the modernist aesthetic sensibility. One of the things that's going to be critical as well is the advent of photography to all of these dimensions: realism, abstraction, and non-representational works of art. And critical will be, in addition to the advent of photography, the ideology of sharing that kind of thinking, the new kinds of conventions about how art's made, what kind of synthetic pigments, for example, are going to be available through industrial means that will change the way that artists think about color theories and practices. And often that occurs in these communities, which we call art colonies. And there are two in particular that I'm going to focus on. One, as Laura mentioned, is one that I'm researching, which is the Appledore Island, which in my opinion, I think is the first actual art colony in America. And the other one, of course, is going to be focusing on what's happening down in Provincetown at the advent of the 20th century. And I'll be culminating with a couple of the artists who are going to be critical to that evolution of design and practice into the 1960s. So the first person I'm going to talk about in regard to that is the artist whose name is Winslow Homer, of course, a very well-known and certainly affectionately revered artist in this region. I show you this dapper photograph of him, and it's in part because Winslow Homer is going to be one of the first people that embraces photography as an art form unto itself. And one of the reasons that occurs is that the advent of photography in America happens in Boston. The first photographic studio that exists in America is going to be constructed in the North End, what we know now to be the North End, in the 1840s by a couple of painters who couldn't get enough commissions, so they transitioned to photography, and their names were Southworth and Hawes. And the advent of photography as a tool of creativity is going to be, of course, open for debate, even in some instances today. But the reality was that once the technological advancements of photography came to fruition, it would change the way that artists are going to think about how they are going to have to compete first with the medium, but also how they're going to have to rethink their own disciplines in order to be able to keep themselves relevant at a time period when it was so much easier to go to a photographic studio down the street and have a portrait done for a couple of bucks, as opposed to having an artist spend a protracted period of time executing a portrait about you. And Homer realizes the impact of this kind of new technological advancement. And he's going to use it to his advantage. In fact, what he writes about in his very cryptic transcriptions about his approach to the arts is that he sees photography as a way to inform the painting that he produces, as opposed to seeing it as a competition. See it as a way through which it can advance the discourse about the painting medium and how it can help to, if you will, modernize it in its sensibilities. And in fact, that's what he will spend a great deal of his career focusing on, is how to create the effects of what the distinctions are between photography and painting, but also how photography can be this really extraordinary tool for advancing the kinds of subject matter and the way that those kinds of subject matter are going to be executed in the discipline of the painting medium. And one of the probably most revered paintings produced by Winslow Homer, of course, is this terrific piece, which is done in Gloucester, as a matter of fact, called Breezing Up a Fair Wind. And what's modern about this is, first of all, we are somewhat accustomed to the idea that realism as an art form is going to be some kind of idealized concept of beauty. And Homer is going to distinguish himself by creating a kind of, embrace of the ordinary, the mundane, the everyday. And instead of having images that feature heroic subjects, he's going to focus on things that we call genre scenes, images of daily life. And in this imagery, which is really quite terrific, one of the modern aesthetics is that there's a very immediate sense of the moment in this work of art. So when you're looking at these young folks that are in the midst of this extraordinary ride that they're taking on this boat, the intensity of the dramatic effects of the wind and how the boat is skipping across the water and at a really remarkable pace. But the demeanor of everybody in the boat is very relaxed. They seemingly are embracing the idea of this union, if you will, between man and nature, and even the competitive aspects of that, which are also intrinsic to Homer's work. And what Homer does, which is also a modern convention, is he puts you right in sync with that boat so that you're right there on the water with him. And you're experiencing it in the same kind of way that he would want to visualize it, so that it has that kind of immediate impact for you as you are viewing the scene and experiencing what it is that these individuals are subject to in the dramatic effects of the wind, the lighting circumstances, the immediacy of the moment, as I mentioned. These are all things that will be conventions that Homer will utilize as the influence of photography changing up the way that we think about how subjects of ordinary comportment can be really very illuminating about the American experience, which is something that he's very much in sync with trying to illustrate in the works that he produces. So he's the first person that's really going to start to think about new conceptualizations about realism. And that makes him somebody that's very much a part of that modern aesthetic sensibility. And once he begins to think about those kinds of narratives, creating these storytelling effects, if you will, that will sort of lend itself to the dramatic effects of the moment, Homer will advance that by, once again, in a similar work of art. This is owned by the Museum of Fine Arts in 1885, The Fog Warning, a terrific piece, which is very New England in terms of its subject matter. It features this sailor or fisherman that's out in the middle of what's believed to be the Outer Banks off the coast of Cape Ann, Massachusetts. And in the midst of this dramatic, if you will, display of weather, once again, the immediacy of the moment, as you see that instantaneous rise of the boat off the water, as this man realizes, as he's looking off into the distance, he's about ready to be subject to one of the most extreme weather effects, which is also very immediate and very pressing. It's called a waterspout. Those of you who live on the Cape, I'm sure, are keenly aware of what this can mean in terms of your relative ability to survive these things, because it's like an instantaneous hurricane. And he looks off into the distance and he sees the mother ship that he has come from off in the distance. And the debate, sort of almost a kind of emotional and psychological tension that Homer infuses into this, which is also a very modern sensibility, is the idea that he leaves open to debate whether this individual will actually be able to survive this moment. Will he be able to make it back to the ship in time before he's subjected to the whims of the extraordinary effects of weather? And in that respect, once again, it's a very ordinary subject from the standpoint of it not being heroic in the traditional sense of heroicism, but the idea of that competition between man and nature, and that thematic approach of the individual in his relationship to the dramatic effects of what nature can impose upon them, are things that are very much a part of that modern aesthetic sensibility in terms of rethinking realism that Homer is very much enamored of, and will make very much a part of his displays throughout his life and his career. Where that is enhanced and advanced is by the 1880s. We, of course, have had the influence of French Impressionism make its way into the vernacular in American art. Many Boston artists are heading off, to Paris in order to study the vanguard of Impressionism in the 1880s and certainly into the 1890s. And they bring that material back to the city of Boston with them and create the first advent of what we call the Boston Impressionism School. Homer is somewhat ambivalent about the idea of embracing European conceptualizations because he's a profoundly American artist. And what instead he does is he begins to transition his interests away from Impressionism in its European sense and transcribes those same kinds of essential, if you will, contributions of light and atmosphere and materials into the works that he produces, once again, related to his New England experience. So it's very much a part of his own lifestyle that he's trying to imbue into the works of art that he produces. A terrific work which will also sort of hearken upon his admiration and appreciation for watercolor is this terrific piece, which is called Sunset Fires from 1880. And you'll notice here that the kinds of very cryptic transcriptions of paint on the surface of this paper are very elemental, very almost ephemeral, in that those conditions of the watercolor begin to dissipate so that you can clearly see the texture of the paper underneath. And in areas where you see that there is white, he literally has left no pigment at all to ensure that that relationship between the surface upon which he's painting and the subject matter that he's rendering in all of its essential forms are very much combined. In the foreground, you see on the lower right-hand side, it appears to be some smaller boat with a group of individuals in it. And we see that it's very, elemental in terms of its descriptions. We see shapes and forms rather than the detailed kinds of materials, which are traditionally a part of what Winslow Homer's inceptions of realism were all about. So he's beginning to relinquish that control, if you will, and become more influenced by the idea of just the essences of creating shape and form and allowing the imagination to fill in some of those ephemeral blanks, and allows the viewer to have a much more experiential kind of relationship with the work of art. So in that respect, Homer's introduction of watercolor into the mix, which had always been seen as a peripheral art form, is another modern convention. And we know certainly throughout his career, probably some of the most well-known and beloved works that he produces, which are highly marketable, are the watercolor pieces that he generates. In fact, he's churning out so many watercolors that he can't keep them in the studio. He can't give away his oil paintings because no one wants them because they're too big and too cumbersome. Whereas these really sort of very essential and very, very complete images in all of their essences are the things that many Americans in terms of collectors are beginning to embrace and to revere as part of his legacy. Of course, as he travels further north to come to Maine, where he ends up living out the last years of his life in a place called Prout's Neck, probably one of the most volatile places on the New England coast. First of all, because of its isolation. At this juncture in time, in the late 1890s, when he merges with his relationship of Maine culture, he finds himself to be increasingly more reflective and certainly much more responsive to the whims of nature and to the powers of nature. And increasingly, he begins to relinquish his connections to human figures and spends most of his time focusing on the energetic qualities of what nature has imposed upon the landscape. And in this one, once again, that kind of photographic essence, where we see the splash of those waves that really create that almost infinitesimal moment of visual conception, he's able to solidify and turn into this moment that is almost a kind of essence of all the emotions, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you think, what you taste. All of those things are sort of incorporated into this very seemingly, expediently and spontaneously transcribed moment of time. So Homer is going to be the first person that sort of lands himself into that rethinking of how realism is going to be reconstituted in many respects, given the circumstances of how photography and other kinds of technology are going to affect the way that artists are thinking and working. I add tangentially to that, the introduction of synthetic pigments that are industrially made are going to create a whole new avenue of color experimentation that artists such as Winslow Homer and others are going to experiment with, that really do allow them to exercise their creative impetus in new ways that I think enrich and enliven the idea of this transition towards some kind of modern aesthetic sensibility. And from Homer, I traveled to a place that some of you might be familiar with. This is going to be the next location of significance in the translation of realism through the filter of impressionism to what we consider to be abstraction. I'll show you a really nice photograph here, a terrific work, which was from 1901. And it happens to be the hotels that are on the island of Appledore in the Isle of Shoals off the coast of both New Hampshire and Maine. They both have claimed ownership of those islands. And this was a place that was also a place of respite, but also a place that really was subject to the whims of the extraordinary powers of nature. And in the 1860s, probably one of the most important people that's going to loom large is a woman by the name of Celia Thaxter, who is a very famous poet from Boston. I should say from Portsmouth, New Hampshire originally. I have to be corrected on that. But she does spend a great deal of time in Boston. And eventually she begins to create an artist colony on the island of Appledore, where her father has created this beautiful hotel complex, as you can see beautifully transcribed here. And the most important aspect of that is that first and foremost, this will be a place where she can bring together some of the great minds of her time to have a conversation, to change some kind of narrative with respect to how those disciplines of literature and music, the visual arts, philosophy, and even politics are going to be constructed and conducted. And she will entertain over the lifetime of her experiences there from the 1860s up until her death in 1894, some of the most important figures in the history of American culture. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, or Nathaniel Hawthorne will be there, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Sarah Ornette Jewett, who will be one of the more preeminent artists that comes out of the 19th century. William Morris Hunt will actually spend many of his summers there and in fact tragically die there on a summer vacation toward the latter part of his career, and a very famous artist that we'll talk about in a moment, whose name is Childe Hassam. Also, just as an aside, a wonderful discovery is a new young artist named Ellen Robbins, who was a terrific watercolorist inspired by the works that were being produced by Winslow Homer. And the idea of this place being a kind of seminal, institute, or what we call a colony, is going to be generated by the idea of the ability of Celia Thaxter to think about in much larger terms, the confluence between man, nature, and the larger subjects that confront us in terms of our existence, our coexistence with nature, and also the cyclical courses of nature, which she seems metaphorically able to incorporate into some of the poetry that she produces over the career of formidability that she has as both a narrative writer in terms of novels as well as being a poetess. She also cultivates there some exquisite gardens. And these gardens are going to become the source material for a lot of painters that go to the island specifically to see what she's been able to construct in terms of her garden venues. And in fact, many will argue that her gardens are paintings unto themselves because of her creative impetus. And she will be, in fact, not only a wonderful poetess, but she will be a terrific painter herself. She's a marvelous watercolorist. And she's also somebody that's going to spend an awful lot of time working on painting ceramics. As she begins to cultivate certain kinds of botany on the island of Appledore, she'll begin to incorporate those materials into the tangible objects that she produces or that she has available to her on the island itself. And as she is in the midst of that, she's really thinking about the ways through which, the second half of the 19th century really requires a modern thinking that is relevant to the transformations that are taking place socially, politically, and culturally in New England and ultimately in the Americas. And she will be a critical figure in advancing those kinds of dialogues to speak about how the modern sensibility is very much a part of what will be the intrinsic, if you will, innovative processes that have always been a characteristic or a subtext of American culture, generally speaking, from the inception of the colonies all the way up till even in contemporary times. So as she is cultivating these kinds of displays and these kinds of intellectual discourses, one of her favorite figures who's going to loom large and spends many, many years, even after her death, he continues to travel to Appledore until 1914. This is the painter from Boston whose name is Childe Hassam, originally from Dorchester. And I show you a terrific photograph here, as he is also under the influences of how photography as a tool are going to advance or to inform his works. Great imagery where you actually see him in the act of painting, which is a really rare kind of photographic instance, as many artists are resistant to that comparatively to other professions. But here, Childe Hassam is spending his afternoon essentially sort of revising and refining materials that he has executed while he's been painting, as we call it, en plein air, outside of the beautiful cottage that Celia Thaxter had constructed there. And in fact, many of the artists that will come to Appledore Island will have their own little shacks where they can go off in the morning, spend their afternoons painting, and then come back at night and share a meal with the other individuals, and they can share ideas and share their experiences in earnest. And for Hassam, of course, he's been much inspired by the Boston Impressionist movement. He's had a chance to experience Europe. He understands the complexities and the challenges of trying to create a modern vision about the world. And he brings that information back with him and creates this really exquisite piece. This is a little late, 1905, from the Isle of Shoals, which is called Sunset Sky. And increasingly, you'll notice, particularly with Childe Hassam and others, more and more evident in the works of art that they produce are going to be the hand of the artist made very visible. So that rather than conceal the hand of the artist, you see every single stroke. So where the paintbrush went down on the canvas and where it came up off the canvas. You can also see how he literally, with a palette knife, is going to blend those colors together in order to be able to create these really sort of essential, but very quintessential transitions of light and color, which are going to be the essential core focus of what many of the Impressionists are engaged in. And increasingly subservient to the overarching authority of the painting experience or the painting action itself is going to be the subject matter. So that you'll notice that there is a suggestion of a sunset that's just at the embrace of what we think is the surface of the water. We know that there's a ship that's out there in the distance, but it's very cryptically described. It's more an emphasis on these really sort of wonderful diagonal and horizontal striations of paint that create those essential sort of and very ephemeral moments that many modernists are thinking about how to capture in a way that is going to make them tangible, make them three-dimensional. And the thickness of the paint unto itself is going to become increasingly more an important device through which to make that happen. And Hassam also is going to be somebody who really speaks about the very distinctive qualities of color relationships that he will be engaged in. One of the last works that he produces in 1911 is this terrific piece, also from the Isle of Shoals, which is called Sunset at Sea. And again, the same kind of subject matter, except in a very dramatically different transcription, where you see the geometry of the piece is much more effectively transcribed in the, the large rectangle of the sea with all of those extraordinary consequences of color and light relationships in terms of the reflection and refraction of light off the surface of the water. the really exquisite color palette, which is rich and diverse, very, very light in terms of its tones and values, a real sort of succinct but very exquisite transcription, once again, of a kind of experience that Childe Hassam really felt was part of the modern existence and modern purposes for what art can bring to fruition in terms of its importance and its relative relationship to the audiences toward whom these images are directed. And I bring that up in part because one of the most important things is we're starting to see American collectors starting to pay attention to the materials that are being produced by American artists, rather than buying the heavy hitters of European art, the Leonardos and the Michelangelos and the Mantegnas. Now we're starting to see an increasing interest in American collectors embracing the idea of trying to latch on to those things that do create an American essence or an American sensibility in some way, shape, or form. And Childe Hassam is going to write himself right into that discourse. Terrific collection of his work, just as an aside, owned by the Cape Ann Museum. And there was a marvelous exhibition of his work, which were just the images he produced on the Isle of Shoals, which were myriad, at an exhibition at the Peabody Essex Museum about 3 or 4 years ago. Really wonderful show. If you have a chance to take a look at the catalog, it's well worth a visit. And then the other place that's going to be, a prominent fixture in terms of the transition of modernism is going to be Cape Ann itself. That will be an enclave where places like Rockport and Gloucester and Essex, Beverly and Ipswich will be centerpieces for a new growing relationship of artists, particularly coming during the great weather, in order to be able to experience the rugged qualities of the New England coast without having to go all the way to Maine. And certainly far up the coast of New Hampshire. There's a kind of an accessibility too, because this is merely, a short drive or short trip from the city of Boston. And as more artists are beginning to find themselves going further afield to get inspiration, one of the artists who will be an essential component of that evolution, particularly in Cape Ann, is going to be the artist named John Sloan. And John Sloan is an artist that comes out of, once again, another aspiration to try to rethink the way that the modern aesthetic or realism is going to be envisioned. And he comes from a group of artists who were known as the Ashcan School Group, very popular group of artists who were working in New York City. He will eventually become part of another group of artists who are a subtext of that, a group which are called the Eight. And what he begins to do in the 19-teens is to travel from, especially during the summer, from New York to Cape Ann, where he explores the wonders of that isolation at this juncture in time and the beauties of nature that are essentially, in many respects, sort of untouched by the tracks of industrialization, that there's a thriving community here that still is focused on the fishing traditions, and that there is a sense of community that really he is very much enamored of. And he himself will also come under the aegis of being influenced by the perceptibility of how you can translate light and atmospheric conditions into something that create this really marvelous sort of confluence between water, light, land, and the activities of human action that go on in and around these kinds of places. So he'll begin to relinquish his attachment to realism in its authentic representational form and begin to work much more in sync with the idea of these very sort of immediate moments of transcription of light and activity that will be at the core of what many modernists are beginning to embrace. And as his works begin to mature, this is a terrific piece which is called Glare on the Bay, about circa 1914, maybe 1913. He'll also turn his attention to other subjects like portraiture as a way through which to once again rethink the way that the modern aesthetic sensibility is coming to fore. And in that respect, this is a terrific work which is owned by the Cape Ann Museum, and it's a piece which is called The Old Cone, Uncle Sam, about 1914 as well. Here we find that it's not that kind of idealized conceptualization that was always associated with portraiture, where you take the individual and embellish them and enhance them, which would be critical or core component of what realism was all about under the aegis of the traditions of American painting. But John Sloan is going to abandon that to give you a sense of, once again, that essence of being, the essence of the individual, the character of the figure that you see that's on display here. The fact that once again, the color scheme is very provocative in terms of its subdued nature, highly contrasted light that permeates over the face of the individual, real essence of some kind of humanity here, which will be intrinsic to the type of art that John Sloan had produced while he was a member of the Ashcan School, but now taken to its next level of accomplishment as his sensibility of painting begins to mature and to change over time based on the influences that are going on around him. And he's not the only person that's going to be thinking about using Cape Ann as a core centerpiece for where much of this action takes place. Many will argue that, in fact, it is an artist colony because of the numbers of artists that are recruited and that maintain residences there, certainly during the beautiful weather, and the connection that they have to the essences of human action and nature, and the importance of having an environment where you can exchange ideas and notions with other artists who are in the same thought processes that you are experiencing yourself. A terrific place, which is called Dogtown. I don't know if anybody knows about Dogtown, a really interesting little enclave that was abandoned in the 1700s and has taken on a kind of mythology. It was a place where people would graze their animals in order to, especially women were grazing their animals while their husbands were off fighting the revolution. And then it became this kind of abandoned landscape. Once that occurs, we see that the forces of nature take over, and it creates the suggestion of space that goes on ad infinitum. Dogtown was once known as Common Town, and it was a place where a lot of artists really felt that they could go out into the landscape and transcribe what they saw in terms of the transitions of season or of light or of time of day, relatively uninterrupted because of its, if you will, sort of rugged and seemingly jarring aspects of existence, almost primitive in quality to the way that it may have looked at one point in time before the inception or the intervention of mankind. And Sloan will be the person that starts to bring this subject matter into focus for a lot of artists who are working in Gloucester and Rockport, et cetera, so that other artists who are following after his influence will come here and they will reinvent this subject matter numerous times. And probably the person that's going to do it most succinctly is an artist who comes right out of the school of Alfred Stieglis, is the artist whose name is Marsden Hartley. And this is his interpretation, which he does in 1931, of that very same landscape that John Sloan had produced in his transcription of Dogtown. And you'll notice radical changes have taken place here. The color scheme is really quite dramatic. And the surface of the pictorial plane is becoming increasingly more two-dimensional, so that you'll see that that suggestion of Blueberry Highway goes up at this radical angle, as opposed to that embrace of traditional kinds of illusionism that we're accustomed to. Let me just bring this back so that you can look at that, where the beautiful transitions of the foreground to the middle ground to the background, and those really sort of exquisite atmospheric effects of the mountainscape in the distance or the hills in the distance, which is very traditionally a part of what the vernacular of an academically trained artist would be engaged in, has now radically been upended by Marsden Hartley, who really thinks about trying to assert the preeminence or predominance of the surface of the two-dimensional pictorial plane upon which he's actually painting. And this is where we see that transition to abstraction really now start to become that much more tangible.
And Carol, I have the first question, and I was thinking the same thing as this person, which is where exactly is Dogtown?
Good question. I'm sorry I didn't mention it. It's actually on a piece of landscape that is owned both by Gloucester and by Rockport. So it's this thin region of land that is claimed by both. And as I mentioned, it has a historical importance because it was a place where a communal gathering would occur for people that would graze their animals, or that they would have that arena where they could, put their horses to graze, or if their animals got loose, they would be brought to Dogtown and they would be left there until somebody came to claim them. And this almost a kind of mythology has begun to emerge around this place because of its historical significance in relationship to its communities. It's now a place where people walk their dogs. And it is a relatively significant kind of hiking trail that many people still are engaged in, because it appears to be almost kind of a rocky landscape, something that you would experience in the Green Mountains, as opposed to something that appears right along the coast. So it has that kind of meaning and mentorship in many respects to the Cape Ann community. I just love the name Dogtown. I just think it carries all of its own intrinsic, if you will, metaphorical meanings. But that said, Marsden Hartley will return to this subject almost 30 times. And I show you just another example, which is called Autumn Landscape, Dogtown from 1934, where once again, you're starting to see that disintegration of that reliance on reality as we understand it. And as representational art has always put into the mix, starting to become that much more ephemeral and that much more deconstructed in many respects. Also, different types of media. For example, new kinds of applications with mixing graphite with different types of oils, as in this, and new kinds of platforms upon which to paint. Instead of using canvas, he was using some kind of a museum board. The dramatic effects of color, the increasing ambiguity of what it is you're looking at, it begins to take on all those authorities, which will essentially be associated with abstraction, a kind of simplification, and leaving just an essence, really, of what the subject matter is as a hook for individuals to be able to cling to, but really rethinking that idea about our attachment to reality, which is what many abstract artists are going to begin to embark upon. And this is a gradual process. It's not something that happens immediately. It's happening over a protracted period of time. And Marsden Hartley will be a critical figure, particularly in the early modernist sensibility in American culture, introducing these new kinds of conceptualizations. I mentioned Alfred Stieglis because Stieglis would be somebody that is a huge, who's married to Frida Kahlo, but had a wonderful gallery called 291 in New York, one of the first galleries in the United States that actually showed modern works of art by young contemporary artists who were doing things like this, certainly in contradistinction to the overarching embrace of, say, American Impressionism, which was still very popular, even at this time in American collectors and in connoisseurship. And I just want to throw in another figure that I have great affection for, Maurice Prendergast, who is also from Dorchester. In his transcriptions of Annisquam, he will also sort of reinvigorate the idea of using watercolor as a medium for high art. Something in service, perhaps, or in dedication to, or in acknowledgement of the contributions of Winslow Homer. I knew that, and in this imagery, which is really quite extraordinary, it sort of looks like a piece of stained glass, which is something that Maurice Prendergast really loved, the idea of craft arts. And he also acknowledges the idea that there's a new kind of convention that's taking place, in that these are leisure activities where people will travel to the coast specifically to engage in going swimming or to experience nature that is not ordinarily available to them. So that the shacks that you see that permeate the shoreline, these are changing houses where people could go in and change out of their formal clothes and get into a bathing suit, go take a swim, come back out, change back into their clothes with relative amount of privacy. And this becomes a kind of new convention of leisure activity in American culture that Maurice Prendergast really is quite enamored of. The beautiful synthesis of color, the wonderful architecture here, once again, kind of flattening out of the pictorial plane, but more importantly, just the reduction of the figures and the forms in terms of the individuals here broken down into just shapes, so that you garner the essence of what the activity is, but it's really nondescript. And there are no details that you can cling to, which would traditionally have been the kind of methodology that most realist painters would have embarked upon. Now we're starting to see that transition to a much more, if you will, sort of simplified and abstract innovation, which will be characteristic of what Prendergast's work is going to be about, particularly along the New England coast, and then eventually as he moves further afield and finds himself in New York as a member of a group which are called the 10, which is after the culmination of the group of artists who were known as the 8, associated with John Sloan and the Ashcan School. So these nice sort of extensions are beginning to come to fruition, certainly as made manifest in this new vanguard of visionary artists. And another figure who's going to loom large, Stuart Davis. Some of you might be very familiar with him. Terrific works of his that are owned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Spends his summers as well in the 1930s up there. So there's an increasing sort of draw once there's been a kind of cachet established about these locations, Rockport and Gloucester and et cetera. You're going to start to see more and more artists travel here, specifically to try to interpret those experiences on themselves. And with uniquely different types of interpolations. So whereas Prendergast is still working with those beautiful transcriptions of color and the essences of individual action. Stuart Davis is much more enamored of the stuff, so that he focuses on the architecture and he focuses on the rigors of the ship or of the kind of ephemera that he would find existence on the docks. And he reconfigures that in these myriad sketches that he does over a protracted period of time throughout the 1930s, really sort of giving you a hook of recognizability that you can associate with, but clearly having reconfigured or reinterpreted what that landscape or what that seaside village looked like. So he's somebody that is sort of bridging that transition between realism and abstraction as it begins to move further and further afield and becomes increasingly more complex, certainly more invigorating, and certainly more challenging to the viewer to begin to embrace and to try to grapple with in terms of its meaning and its content, as well as its construction. And as that occurs, we see probably the quintessential figure who will spend an awful lot of time as the bridge between Maine, Cape Ann, and then Cape Cod. Of course, the beloved figure of Edward Hopper, who in the 1920s first travels to Maine, perhaps under the aegis of the influences of somebody like Winslow Homer, who has already established a kind of credibility about the coastal subject matter. Edward Hopper's vision is quite different in that his transcriptions are a lot more, let's say, complex in terms of their meaning or the content. A little bit more ambivalent about the meaning of the works in particular. Some have argued that these appear more like stills that come out of movies as opposed to actual transcriptions of some kind of specific moment, because they seem very timeless in their quality, despite the fact that there are very succinct kinds of transcriptions of light and atmospheric conditions. And as Hopper travels from Maine to further afield to Cape Ann, he also is going to become very much enamored of Dogtown, except he's going to refer to it as Cape Ann Granite in 1927. Very different kind of experience, certainly a very different kind of day, much earlier in terms of its conceptualization toward abstraction than, say, the work of Marsden Hartley's, but this very invigorated kind of color scheme that will be at the heart of what Edward Hopper's really kind of innovative approach to, once again, rethinking realism and making it that much more, if you will, intangible, to try to put your finger on it, to understand it in all of its entirety. But the idea that the landscape is still this very quintessential component through which to experiment with these subjects is something that increasingly becomes more of the narrative behind the works that Edward Hopper produces. He finds that Cape Ann gets too crowded. And increasingly, the more frequently that it becomes popularized during the summer, he finds that the ability for him to be able to work more creatively and with greater freedom is going to be inhibited. So what he will gradually begin to do is he will travel, of course, from Cape Ann down through the filter of places like Gloucester and these exquisite transcriptions of these landscapes, eventually will make his way to the Cape. And it's because he finds that places like Truro do have that kind of isolation that allows him to experiment with his creativity in a much more substantive way, unimpeded by the competition, so to speak, of other artists who are living and working in that same area during the summer seasons. And these are really quite exquisite in terms of their intrinsic beauty, but complicated in terms of the kinds of quote unquote psychological conventions that perhaps are being infused into the discourse about Edward Hopper's work. I have to say, he was somewhat mystified by the fact that people saw these images this way, because he didn't see them as having that kind of psychological complexity. But perhaps it is, the fact that there is this almost garish quality of light as it reflects and refracts off of the surfaces of these houses that seemingly are empty, that have no human interaction overtly seen or exhibited. Those are things that perhaps lend people to allow their imaginations to expand or run wild as they try to reconfigure, what these images are meant to convey in terms of some kind of larger message or larger issues, which many people feel is, a quintessential component of what art is supposed to do. Hopper argued that it is what it is. So embrace it for what it can represent, not necessarily for what hidden meaning may be articulated in these images. And probably the last and one of the most famous images that he produces while he's in Truro is this terrific work, which is called Gas from 1940. Also the kind of mysterious lighting circumstances here. Where does this generate? Almost an ethereal light that seems to permeate down upon this man as he's at his gas pumps, probably locking up for the night. The isolation and the absence of any kind of humanity in many respects to accompany it are the things that really sort of drove Hopper to think outside the box with respect to the idea of how realism can have its modern conventions and can have its modern complexities without relinquishing all of your attachments to the representational world. So this is going to be another sort of parallel theme that many artists are going to be exploring as they're thinking about how to put into some kind of construct a specific set of criteria that we could argue would be a modernist sensibility. And of course, many of the works that Edward Hopper produced, of course, were in Truro, which is very much adjacent to where Provincetown really comes to fruition as this institution of creativity at the advent of the early part of the 20th century. And it has to do with the fact that Charles Hawthorne, who is a very famous painter in Boston or in the Boston, New York arena, decided to establish the Provincetown Art Association in 1914. And I show you this wonderful photograph here, once again, thinking about the confluence between photography and modernism, where Charles Hawthorne himself is actually conducting a class of students painting en plein air. So there is that strong attachment to the kind of immediacy of recording the moment of time that presents itself right before your very eyes, as opposed to the protracted and sometimes tedious practice of bringing your images back to the studio to refine and revise and refine. There was a kind of authenticity or purity that was thought to exist in the tradition of plein air painting. And what he will do, Charles Hawthorne will do, is he, among others, will establish a very prominent art colony, which many argued was a refuge for artists who were expatriates. Those artists who, unfortunately, because of the circumstances of World War I and eventually World War II, were required to leave Europe and needed to find respite somewhere where they could expand upon their creativity unimpeded. And from that discourse, this colony that is established becomes, quote unquote, as the Boston Globe will argue, in 1916, the biggest art colony in the world. And I use that in quotations. But it's still mostly a colony that is attended, because of the ability to create an art museum that would be a place for art to be exhibited that was being produced down there. There were certainly a whole range of museums that were associated with exhibiting the works that were being generated by these artists. And the singular museum, the Provincetown Museum, has something in the vicinity of about 2,500 works in their permanent collection, which is really quite remarkable for a very small institution. But it will come from that idea of Impressionism that we see the transition for artists thinking about more modern kinds of exhibitions. And interestingly enough, the Provincetown Museum will have to have competing exhibitions ongoing at the same time because there was such ambivalence about embracing modernism as a concept, so that they would have a traditional, if you will, representational show in one set of galleries, and in the opposite set of galleries at the same time, they would have works which were done by modernist artists. And these were the kinds of exhibitions that went on from roughly late 1920s into the 1930s. And it's under this aegis where there is going to be this competitive qualities ongoing between traditional conceptualizations about thinking about art and new visionary constructs about the arts, that we're going to start to see women come into the spectrum. And you probably are asking why we have not seen any in this display. And it's in part because women, for the most part, had been essentially marginalized by the biases that were intrinsic to the canon of Western art that many subscribe to. So it was interestingly enough in Provincetown, we begin to see one of the first most important collections of women artists come to fruition to practice their work and then to exhibit it. And in the 1920s is established what's called the Provincetown Printmakers colony. And in that colony, or in that aegis of colonists, were a lot of women who essentially had been artists working as illustrators for magazines and for periodicals and for books. And they are going to be bringing their skills to this new ability to have a creative freedom in the arena of Provincetown art colony. And the importance of this is that it's going to be an avenue through which, first of all, to legitimize printmaking as a high art form, and secondarily, to give women artists a forum through which they could actually exhibit their works and to sell their works, which is an important convention as well. And I show you just a really terrific piece, which is by Blanche Lazelle, one of the first founders of the organization. These are mostly woodcuts. This is a piece that she did, which was called Tulips from 1920. Once again, sort of the real sense of craft and the sense of the distortions of the shapes and the forms, much more simplified into an abstract vernacular, is something that Blanche Lazelle is going to introduce into this printmaking discourse. She'll be followed very shortly thereafter by another book illustrator. His name is Agnes Weinrich. Weinrich actually had been to Europe and had studied under the aegis of the French school, which was called the School of Colarossi, that was in Paris. She comes back to the United States and she sets up shop in Provincetown because it's a place where she can work, to execute her interest in more, sort of experimental practices in the printmaking tradition, particularly with woodcuts. This is a great work on the left-hand side, which is called Broken Fence from about 1917. The wonderful thing about this is I actually have the actual wood block itself that she used for creating the print on the right-hand side. So you can actually see the relief surface from which the print was pulled on the left-hand side. The wonderful sense of color, the sense of a kind of flattening out of the pictorial plane will also be something that Agnes Weinrich is going to be introducing or reintroducing to the vocabulary. And these are images that are going to be, seen in terms of their equivalency to the avant-garde that's taking place in Provincetown in the painting medium as well, the traditional painting medium as well. So this is sort of a real sort of heralding of a celebration of women who can equally be engaged in the avant-garde, whereas in previous circumstances, including galleries and museums, their works were not necessarily seen on the same kind of legitimacy scale. It also is going to reinvigorate the idea of bringing craft art back into the vocabulary of expression and seeing it as a vital component of creative output that had otherwise been, for the most part, marginalized, if not completely entirely ignored. One more figure, another favorite of mine, Mildred Macmillan, who is going to create this marvelous piece, which is called The Attic Window. It's a woodcut from 1920. Once again, the marvelous sort of geometry of this piece, the simplification into the black, white, and gray scale, rethinking the way that compositional design and execution is going to be constructed, beautifully transcribed in her really, really elemental but very sophisticated kinds of transcriptions. And she's one of many. I only show you these three, which are just sort of the more recognizable figures from this group, but it will have a kind of resonance whereby printmakers still travel down to Provincetown to this day to be given an opportunity, first of all, to see these works live and in color at the museum, but also to engage in practices that reinvigorate printmaking as an art form in all of its manifestations, whether it's intaglio processes or woodcuts or relief or even in silkscreen or what we call serigraphs. So it's a marvelous kind of connection to have with the advent of the modern aesthetic sensibility, which may in fact have led to one of the reasons why this artist, Hans Hofmann, who is an expatriate from the Netherlands, is going to come during World War II, just prior to World War II, to New York City, because his work is considered to be degenerate. And he is essentially sort of required, as did many of the European modernists, escape to New York City. And Hans Hofmann will open up the first art school, or it's associated with him, in New York City, which will eventually evolve into what's known as the Abstract Expressionist School. And now we see that transition to the what we call non-representational or the non-objective form of creativity. And this is where artists are beginning to think about having been so attached to the natural world, or having been so attached to the realities of the three-dimensional world, the cacophony of what they've been subject to in terms of the transformation of world culture because of World War I and the destructions associated with World War I and with World War II, are going to force artists to think much more cerebrally and think much more about relinquishing their attachments to reality and thinking about the reality of the power of the imagination. And Hans Hofmann is going to be one of those critical figures who will bring that narrative to the fore in the advent of what becomes known as the abstract expressionist school in New York. He also is somebody that's going to cultivate young artists, and the artists that he will begin to solicit are artists who are also marginalized by the largely, if you will, patriarchal arena of the New York School. And to Hans Hofmann's credit, he's going to facilitate the careers of two very important female figures that will be great transitional figures from the idea of abstraction to the authenticity of what we call the non-representational vernacular or art form. And the first figure is going to be, of course, Lee Krasner. And some of you probably know Lee Krasner because she was married to Jackson Pollock. But Lee Krasner was a brilliant artist unto herself who had been cultivated in the New York School by Hans Hofmann. And he solicited her to come to his new school, which he started in the 1940s in Provincetown. So he opens up a new arena whereby that extension of abstraction to non-representational, non-objective art can really blossom in many ways. So I show you this terrific photograph of Lee Krasner in her studio around 1940. And you can already see in the work that she's producing on the canvas, it's a really wonderful imagery because you actually see her working. One of the rare exemplifications where she is what she does, so that the assertion of her as a professional painter is made very clear in that transcription of her identity and her attachment to the work of art that she's painting. And the perimeter wall, which features many of the images that she had produced in the 1930s and into the 1940s when she's working in New York. Additionally, she will be working in mixed media. And this is a piece we believe she actually did execute, or at least in part, while she was in Provincetown. It's a work which is called Desert Moon from 1955. It's an imagery that features collage as well as gesso instead of using oil paint. Collage, gesso, and other mixed media, in other words, other ephemeral material that might have been found in her studio, she begins to apply to the surface of the canvas. And when you're looking at this, it's much more sort of dramatic in terms of the colorations and almost the conflict that's taking place on the pictorial plane between those intense oranges and those vibrant blacks and the purples and pinks that all seem to be fighting with each other on the pictorial plane, very much part of this vernacular that was associated with Hans Hofmann and others called the push-pull effect. In other words, those images would constantly be antagonizing each other, optically speaking, on the surface of the pictorial plane. And that if you will, sort of detachment from reality as we understand it to something that's completely and entirely derived from the imaginative powers of the artist speaks about a new kind of transcription or a new kind of definition about what landscape is. So landscape is now the landscape of the imagination, not necessarily the landscape that's associated with the three-dimensional world, which will be another conceptualization that will become much more fluid as the non-representational vocabulary starts to become the mainstream in American art, particularly during the 1940s and 1950s. She will also create these exquisite images, which are, once again, that kind of drip painting effects, the flattening out of the pictorial plane, the organic nature of the shapes and forms that seem to have literally, a kind of confluence and a conflict with each other in terms of the dramatic effects of color and the intricate shapes and forms that she's able to transcribe, working with a fairly moderately what we would consider, monochromatic scale of colors. So she works principally with black, white, and grays, which will force the artist to think a lot more about how she can get the biggest bang for the buck out of the limited amount of color spectrums that she imposes upon herself, which is a new kind of challenge that creates a kind of intellectual, if you will, comportment that a lot of artists really were struggling with when they were dealing with the idea of the modern sensibility as it's starting to evolve. And not only evolve, but begin to transform the way we think about the object of the painting itself as comparatively to what it is supposed to illustrate to us. And in that respect, Lee Krasner is going to be on the cutting edge of trying to break down those traditions that have always been associated with, the purposefulness of the work of art versus its factual existence as being a mere object of creativity, a product of some kind of creative process. So Lee is going to be traveling one avenue of discourse, and she'll be complemented under the aegis of Hans Hofmann by the other, probably most famous figure that's going to loom large. This is Helen Frankenthaler, who will spend also her time split between New York City as well as her time on the Cape or in Provincetown as part of the members of the colony of Hans Hofmann's school. It's terrific imagery here. The reason why I show you this is just to tell you that with the idea of the new conceptualizations associated with the detachment of connection to realities, that the works become larger in size and scale and proportion at the same time. So you're looking at these wall size, almost mural size transcriptions that are being produced by artists now who have almost an inexhaustibility of availability of paint and their aspirations to create something that's far more dramatic in terms of its size and scale to enhance its experiential qualities. So when you're standing in front of some of these works, they really are enormous and absorb you into the atmospheric qualities of the paint and the materials that the artist is utilizing as tools through which to exemplify some kind of, perhaps it could be an emotional connection to a moment, or it could be a psychological narrative that's being discoursed. It can be anything. And with the advantage of non-representational art, many of these artists are going to leave the options open to you as the viewer as to how to interpret these images, so that there's no right or wrong answer. So it's engaging audiences in very distinctly different ways, other than having a work of art such as an impressionist piece, which is traditionally quite beautiful, but there is no real investigative process that takes place. There's no real substantive interaction between the artist and the viewer, which these artists such as Krasner and Helen Frankenthaler are beginning to explore as being new ways through which to engage the viewer into having some kind of substantive interaction with the work of art, as opposed to being a passive recipient to the materials that they see displayed on the museum walls or in the gallery spaces. And Frankenthaler is going to experiment also with new kinds of materials. She starts out with these marvelous images of Provincetown 1950s that are done in oil. Once again, they do have a strong connection to some conceptualization of landscape, so that there is some essences of reality there, excuse me, that some may be willing to embrace or may need to have in terms of creating an understanding of what the content of the work of art might mean to convey. But these are still very ambiguous relationships and deliberately meant to be so by the artist. And then Frankenthaler is going to start to play with new conventions of practice in the materials that she works with, whereby she begins to thin out the pigments to become almost watercolor in their really translucent qualities, and gradually begins to do away with the idea of covering the surface of the canvas with gesso before you actually begin to apply the paint. And in fact, what she will do is she will allow the paint to be absorbed right into the surface of the unprimed canvas, so that it literally becomes one with the surface of the cloth. And in that respect, like Lee Krasner, she's thinking about the idea of the objectness, if you will, of the painting. That it is this marvelous sort of effect of being able to create that absolute indelible cohesion between the material that you're painting with and the surface upon which you're painting, that now have become indelible to each other and integral to their existence. So in that respect, you'll see these marvelous colors that begin to become that much more, if you will, translucent, like watercolorish. The method through which she actually creates this is that she has this huge contraption whereby she puts the canvas onto a set of like pulleys. And what she does is she will pour the paint onto the surface of the canvas and literally pour or transition the canvas so that it moves up and down or side to side. And what happens is the paint gradually begins to spill into those parts of the canvas that are essentially sort of untouched with gesso, and then begin to become absorbed into it. So it's almost as if she's rethinking the idea about actually using a paintbrush as the principal tool for painting on the surface. Is it necessary? Can you do other kinds of exercises that will extend or advance the idea of the painting medium, relinquished from the traditional kinds of tools that they've been subject to since the inception of time? And in that respect, Frankenthaler is moving far more, if you will, succinctly toward that notion of trying to create a new kind of discussion about the creative process and the hand of the artist at work, where now you don't see the hand of the artist at all. And is it necessary to have that as a visible part of that component of creativity? And that particular process that she creates, this new contraption, she actually is going to work with quite succinctly for the rest of her life. This is a wonderful piece, which is called Orange Breaking Through from 1964. Same kind of thing, where she's going to drip the materials and then she'll spread them by moving the canvas around in a variety of different directions. This is certainly going to allude to the idea of the benefit of the accident, because it's not predictable. She can't determine exactly how these things are going to play out in terms of their finality. So that lends itself to that much more, if you will, kind of solidified embrace of the benefit of whatever opportunity makes itself apparent in the creative action. That, certainly is going to be a dimension of her work that she will experiment with throughout much of her career. And then, of course, I know I'm running a little over time here, and I apologize for that, but just wanted to bring up the idea of that kind of quintessential bringing together of all of those components into these more mature works in the 1960s. This is a wonderful work, which is called Cool Summer. It's the one you also see that's recited behind me, where it is almost translucent in all of its ephemeral products, the much more organic and, if you will, sort of ambiguous shapes and forms. Allow the viewer to extrapolate from the work whatever might be meaningful or important or significant to them personally, as opposed to having some kind of preconceived notions that are put in place under the aegis of what the artist is telling you. So Frankenthaler is going to be really kind of, the figure that will bring a variety of these applications that we've seen in terms of experimental qualities to fruition in the kind of finality of the images that she produces, particularly into the 1960s. And she will continue to spend her time in Provincetown up until the 1970s. So it's a really wonderful and very rich kind of exploration that we can see made manifest in our attachments to how we configure landscape to function, and the idea of inventing new realities to be able to support those new kinds of applications, the new kinds of thought processes, theories, practices, and methodologies that ultimately are going to be at the heart of what modernism is all about. And on that note, I will stop. But I'd be happy to take any kind of questions if you have any for me, as best as I can possibly answer.
Very interesting, Carol. Thanks so much. That I feel like we've been really on a journey when you take us all the way from Homer to Frankenthaler, and really beautiful, beautiful imagery. Maybe you can go ahead and stop the share so we can see everyone, and I can look to see if there are questions. Here we all are. And thank you all so much for being here. And Carol, thank you so much. And now's the time for everyone to ask your questions. I'm going to remove the spotlight and we can sort of see the whole group and see if anyone has a hand raised or wants to ask a question here. Looking around at the group and looking at the chat here and seeing if there's any hands raised about questions. We've gone through such a variety of artists today. And I know some of that was very new to me, particularly the that Dogtown, the number of artists that did that, and also the Isle
of Shoals.
Isle of Shoals, which I didn't know about, and that was very interesting. So looking for questions for Carol. I'm looking in the chat.
Clearly, I'm afraid. It was a run through of time, but I it was more of where are the hoppers from Cape Ann can be seen. If you go to the Cape Ann Museum, they do have a collection of really nice pieces. A couple of other places where you can find them are collections in Maine. Portland Museum of Art has some really, really nice pieces of his as well. They also have a terrific collection of Homer's works, particularly the late works and a lot of watercolors. Bowdoin College has some stuff. So they are out there. I have to say that a majority of hoppers have really been sort of usurped into the collection of, Metropolitan Museum of Art. There are a couple of nice ones at the Museum of Fine Arts, if you're interested in seeing them there.
And so now the questions are really coming.
Oh, yeah.
What is, this is a provocative question, what is the state of art in Provincetown now?
That is a complicated question. I have to say that it is a booming creative center. And there are lots and lots and lots of galleries that have cropped up I have to say the Providence Museum does a really good job of trying to navigate between the varieties of new interests that are being put in place. There's a lot more interest in installation art as opposed to traditional painting, sculpture, and printmaking. It's very diverse in terms of the kinds of artists that they feature. So I'd say it's thriving. I also would say that it's a place that is trying to find a new kind of identity. And it is because the popularity has made it such a centerpiece of probably more pop culture than anything else. That challenges the institutions to try to figure out how to make themselves relevant. And other kinds of conventions that have become very popular outside of installation, public art is a very big component of what they produce down there. Providing new opportunities for artists to do public displays, whether it's in form of three-dimensional artworks or installations. So it's very rich. I'd say it's an exciting place. It's certainly a place that's in transition, but well worth a visit if you are interested in making a trip. I would say don't do it in July or August. Wait until September. Either go down in May or go down in September where it's not as crowded. But it certainly is, well worth the visit if you're interested in seeing what contemporary artists are doing right now.
And we will see one of those artists in our last lecture in this series, which is Jay Critchley. Exactly. And then actually next month, we'll have a talk focused on the Provincetown art colony. So more of Provincetown to come, which is one of my favorite places. Mm-hmm. Here's another comment. Anita Diamond wrote a wonderful novel about Dogtown, The Last Days of Dogtown.
Yes, terrific, yes.
And we have a comment. This has been an amazing trip down the coast of New England. We have learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And she continues, we think Falmouth has quite a collection of terrific artists. Could we call it a colony?
Yeah, you could. What we say, how we say colony is it's got to be a kind of confirmed enclave that is a sort of continuous, that's in continuous practice. So in other words, like the Lime Colony, where artists would return every single year, or the Monadnock colony, where it has, Dublin and Cornish, and artists would return every single year for the very same purposes of that exchange of ideas. There are a myriad of interpretations of what a colony could be, but I would say an enclave would probably be a better word than a formal colony, but absolutely, I'd say there are reasons why people go to Falmouth specifically, in order to be able to do work there, as opposed to going to Orleans or going to Eastham or wherever. So I think you're right.
And of course, the Falmouth Artists Guild has been going since 1965. So there's something. Here is another comment. Thank you for inspiring a post-pandemic tour of the New England museums you have mentioned.
They're all looking forward to seeing you, I'm sure.
And also about the novel by Anita Diamond, not about art, but creatively historical, she says.
It's a very rich place. It's got a long history and revered by the people who live in that community up there, really.
And another a question, did you ever hear of rocks being painted with numbers by an artist in Dogtown?
Have I ever heard of rocks being painted with numbers? You mean like a motif? I'm not sure exactly. In other words, did people paint numbers on the rocks?
And that's a question from Liz. I don't know if you want to expand on that question at all, but it sounds like she's unfamiliar with that particular artist. And so I don't know if that's a modern person.
I had read a book about Dogtown, and I believe that someone painted numbers on rocks, and you can see them if you go hiking.
It's very likely true. I hadn't heard that. I was hiking up there 2 years ago, but I didn't see it, but it's very possible. It's a very, very popular place. And artists still go up there specifically to paint plein air. So it's very likely that that is the case. Yeah, sure.
And here's a follow-up to the Provincetown question. Where is the center of thinking, if not Provincetown? The center of maybe painting and that kind of thing. And
in New England, or do you mean?
Yes, maybe that's about, you know, what is the main art colony in this area if it's not Provincetown?
Well, I have to say, as an art colony, I can't think of any other that are as fluid or as popular in New England. You know, there are still artists that do consider Cape Ann to be a colony of artists. There's a MacDowell colony, which is a very centerpiece of interdisciplinary focus, which is up here in Peterborough, New Hampshire during the summer. That's still an ongoing colony. It has been since 1907. So I think that there's Yaddo that's in upstate New York. I mean, there are centers that do provide different types of mentorships, if you will, or opportunities for artist fellowships. That would be relevant to that. And there are lots of them. I could give you a list if I had a chance just to look at some of my notes from my studio folks.
And that's a good overview. And here's another question. Is neo-realism an important arm of art in these times? I'd
say, yeah. You know, art of appropriation has become de rigueur, as they say. You know, the idea of, you know, strong attachments to reality and hyper reality in many respects. Think of it this way, you can actually create reality on your computer now. So I think that neo-realism, sure. And you'll find avenues through which you can see experimental practices in all of the disciplines with respect to new kinds of conventions about trying to redefine what reality is, what it was, what it means. That's an extraordinarily rich, I think, platform. So yeah, I'd say start with art of appropriation and see how that'll take you to all kinds of connections. And now we have NFTs, which has thrown an entirely huge wrench into the works with respect to reconfiguring the idea of what realism and what art and what the art market is, and how do you show that stuff if you are a gallery or museum. All I can say is may the force be with you. It's there are now virtual galleries. I have students that travel and buy works of art in virtual galleries now, which has become really quite vogue. You know, you can buy a piece of real estate.
And we can almost have a whole other talk on when we start going down that rabbit hole. We're starting to get some nice comments as we start to end up here. I really appreciate your coverage from Winslow Homer to Isles of Shoals, Cape Ann and Cape Cod, all places and art centers familiar to me. Really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you. And here's another meaty question. Do you think COVID isolation has inspired artists?
Absolutely. And I think you could speak to that, Laura, you know, the creativity that you have generated by individuals in your own community that have really sort of, we talked about it very briefly the other day, the idea that in many respects, it has given people an opportunity to rethink, you know, the value of creativity as part of their life experience. And the aspirations to try to reconnect in many respects with their creative selves has been a boon, I think, for institutions like yours, but many others. And I think just generally speaking, people have had time to be able to indulge themselves and allow themselves to think more creatively, whether it's writing or whether it's painting or whether it's weaving or whatever, or sculpture, installation, whatever inspires you. I think
that's absolutely true. And as we talked, Carol and I talked, and we've seen it here of people really choosing to use this time to work on their art practice. Mm-hmm. Here's another question. Occasionally it's a comment, occasionally the Boston Globe will have an article on Dogtown with pictures of the rocks. I think it may be a mystery as to why they were created.
Yeah, I know. I think the Boston Globe did an article. It was a couple of years ago. There was an exhibition. That's what it was. There was an exhibit of work, and I think it was at the Cape Ann Museum, because they had such a plethora of interest. And they have such a plethora of works that they wanted to show the broad base of interpretation, both contemporary artists and historical figures. So yeah, it's a very interesting place. I can tell you, I hiked it for the first time a couple of years ago with a friend who lives in Ipswich. And it was illuminating to me to see that place. And it is this extraordinary, almost primitive kind of landscape. And it's beautiful depending upon the time of year that you're there, because the color changes quite dramatically, from season to season. So I can see why it was a huge inspiration for a lot of artists to go there and to revisit it every year, because it always introduced something new to the vocabulary that they had explored.
Thank you for that and for all of these questions. And thank you so much, Carol. This has really been a wonderful talk. I'm gonna wrap it up here as we're coming up to
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. So thank you all for coming. We hope to see you next week. Thank you, Carol Scollans. We hope to see her again soon. And we'll see you all soon in person or on Zoom.
Yeah, all the best. Take good care.
Take care. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.